I'm Hilary Silver. I'm a professor of sociology, international affairs, and public policy and public administration at George Washington University. And we'd like to welcome you to another in our series of the university seminar on Europe since COVID. Today, we are going to have a discussion of prospects for the new European Migration and Asylum Pact, with some implications for American immigration policy. I wanted to just let all of you know the session is being recorded. So this webinar follows upon some events we had in the fall, such as one on Black Lives Matters in Europe. So we're looking at a number of topics that are of particular interest to our American audience while taking advantage of our ability to do these seminars, webinars online, and then invite Europeans. So this unfriendly hour is partly because of time differences. So I welcome all of you who are brave enough to get up on a Monday morning at 9 to hear a bit more about the European Migration and Asylum Pact that in 2021 became the responsibility of the Portuguese Presidency of the European Union. And it is one of their handful of priorities for their 6-month presidency. As you will recall, in September of 2020, the European Commission introduced the new Migration and Asylum Pact, and they presented it as a reset that would jettison the unpopular Dublin approach, and rather than impose any kind of quotas of resettlement on member states, will now allow for what is being called mandatory flexible solidarity. Contributions to the migration and asylum actions of the European Union, but not necessarily exactly the same thing. This pact faces many challenges. It requires Frontex to be adequately funded and so that it can prevent human trafficking. It requires the protection of asylum seekers and migrants who often arrive together at the frontline states, and to provide really decent living conditions when they arrive. As you know, there was a terrible fire in the Moria refugee camp on the island of Lesbos this year, and caused great hardship. It was already hardship, but the policies there led to a lot of protests. It entails speeding up the processing of legitimate claims at the external borders while respecting rights. And a lot of human rights activists are concerned about the pact. And it entails relocating or deporting people who arrive. And this is all at the same time. It's important to preserve the whole point of the European Union, free movement within, dealing with migrant workers and recruiting highly skilled legal immigrants. That also entails negotiating with third countries. And then when it's all together, it has to win approval from the Council and the Parliament. So there are a lot of governance challenges ahead. Given the change borders in Turkey, Libya, and so on, as well as the arrivals by sea and land over the Balkans and so on, that there's also the challenge of resistance of some member states to their obligations of solidarity and shared responsibility for immigration and integration. So we have assembled two super experts to speak to us about the pact, current immigration issues in Europe generally, and to offer just a few comparative observations, given that the new Biden administration has already issued some executive orders on immigration and DACA, and will obviously have make an attempt to reform American immigration policy. Our speakers will speak for about 20 minutes each. There'll just be a brief exchange between the two of them, and then we'll open up the discussion for your questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A section, right? And hopefully we can get to some before the end of the hour. Our first speaker is Hanne Beirens. She's the director of Migration Policy Institute Europe. She specializes in EU policies related to asylum and migration, human trafficking, labor migration, and youth. She worked as a consultant for the European Commission for quite a while at the European Migration Network. And she has a PhD as well. After working in a number of applied settings, she also has a PhD in sociology and ethnic relations, so from the University of Warwick. So I want to welcome her. She will be the first speaker, and then she's going to outline the actual EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, the policy shifts that it entails, why it matters, what are the fault lines among the member states about that, and what we can expect from the Portuguese presidency. She'll be followed by James Hollyfield, who's the Ora Nixon Arnold Chair in International Political Economy and a political scientist, and the director of the Tower Center at Southern Methodist University. And he is no stranger to Washington. He is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and also a fellow in the ESA in Germany, and also at the Global Migration Center in Geneva. He's written widely. He has so many books on migration, I'm not even going to list them all, though he has several that are always one is already in its 4th edition. So I urge you to look up Jim's work as well. He's also served as an advisor for governments around the world and international organizations. And he will talk for about 20 minutes on the context of particularly the political context for the EU new pact and how it resembles or differs from the Biden administration approach. So without further ado, let me turn over the Zoom room to Hanne Beirens.
Thank you very much, Hilary, for setting the scene in such a great manner. And I would also like to warmly welcome everyone out there and for joining us so early. I think I'm part of the reason why you're all having to wake up so early and have your coffee now and listen to us. But I really appreciate this opportunity and we're looking forward to the discussions. I'll share my screen so that you can follow my PowerPoint. I hope you can see it. Yeah. Okay, great. So as Hilary has kindly laid out, my aim is to briefly talk you through the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, its main building blocks, then zoom in a bit more on the common European asylum system, which is one particular dimension of the pact, but which is causing the greatest attention amongst the EU member states for the moment, and then indeed end with focusing on what the Portuguese presidency is hoping to do. So every 6 months, the presidency of the Council of the European Union rotates, and from the 1st of January, it's the Portuguese government who's taking over, and in the past 6 months, it was Germany. So yeah, the EU Pact on Migration is such an important one. Why? Because the last reform dates back from 2015, 2016, when many of you will know nearly 2 million migrants and asylum seekers came to Europe. And so at the time, the European Commission launched an EU agenda on migration, which set out its priorities. And then also in the wake of that, came forward with a list of legislative instruments that were supposed to reform how the migration and asylum system was going to work henceforth. But after almost 5 years of negotiations, no agreement was attained between the member states. And so, as Hilary already has outlined, when the new European Commission came into place in December of 2019, the president of the European Commission, Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, really promised a kind of a fresh start, a clean slate on migration, and that her and her team would come forward with a new set of ideas. And the aim was threefold. On the one hand, what they said is that they would deal with migration and asylum in a comprehensive and well-managed manner. And those of you who've listened to some of the statements, that word comprehensive comes back time and again. Why? Because the idea is that we saw that the EU approach was quite fragmented. And in 2015, 2016, we realized that there were problems as to how we were cooperating with third countries in dealing with what was then called the root causes of migration, that we didn't have a sound or very optimal functioning border management system, that we had problems internally. So this comprehensive approach is really aimed to tackle all different kind of phases in the migration trajectory and making sure that all different actors are involved. Also, the fact was that the EU was caught quite unprepared and in almost as a kind of a surprise, and that had lots of problems and really plunged the whole of the EU in an institutional crisis. And so all governments agreed that they needed a crisis response mechanism. And finally, there was also, of course, the continent is actually aging. There's demographic reasons for making sure that the countries within Europe also have access to the skills and talents that they need in order to be able to function economically. And so what are some of the interesting shifts for you to think about or to focus on, both in terms of what the pact focuses on, so the themes, but also the ways in which the Commission is trying to negotiate on this, which I think is also quite an interesting and a different kind of take. So as I said, in 2015, the Juncker Commission also came up with a set of strategy documents. And as I said, that unfortunately failed. So what you could say is that Mrs. von der Leyen's team has really learned from some of the issues that the previous Commission faced. So first of all, what happened the first time around in 2015, 2016 is that the Commission presented a kind of package of proposals and then started the whole negotiation process. And many member states in the course of the years complained about that approach. They felt that they were put in front of kind of an already well and very detailed set of proposals, and then they had to go back and start to revisit that. And so what this Commission did this time round is said, okay, before we come out with our package of proposals, we're going to consult with the member states, 2-3 consultation rounds. The first one was in real life, and then as the pandemic hit, it was online. But that really resulted in a kind of more agreement on the pact already when the pact was launched in September. And also it opts for like a political top-level document, which is called the pact, and which is about, I think, 25 pages, and which is then accompanied with a long list and very detailed legislative documents. And the aim that there is now is to really come to a political agreement where alongside technical discussions about legislative instruments. And it seeks to have a far-reaching compromise on solidarity, which I'll come back in a moment. And it has a really strong operational component. I think that's also quite different to what we've seen before, which was top-level documents, legislative broad principles, methods. Here we're really seeing a Commission that goes into the nitty-gritty of what is going to happen at the borders when, as Hilary said, these kind of mixed arrivals of migrants and asylums would come. And so the pact was often presented by the Vice President of the European Commission, Margaritas, as the 3 floors of the Acropolis. And so there's an external dimension, there's a border management dimension, and there's an internal one. Let's get into this one now. So the external dimension, I think that was a key shift that we saw since 2015. The EU felt like, oh my God, we were so unprepared for this, for how to deal with these large inflows. And a key realization was we need to really work better with the countries in our neighborhoods and seek to work together to better manage migration. So whereas in the past, the external dimension was a bit underdeveloped, now it's really started to flex their muscles. And so there's partnership with third countries. And this pact also puts forward the kind of intention to talk to third countries in a different way, not always focus on, can these third countries help us to deal with the root causes? Are they willing to take on their citizens back, the returnees? Are they willing to help us to stop irregular migration or smuggling? So that's the will. We'll see if that actually works and whether that's actually happening in practice. And there's, of course, the focus on labor migration, really working on that, and the support to first countries of asylum, so those hosting already large populations of refugees. Then the second floor of this 3-story building is focusing on border management and unauthorized movements. And here, of course, Frontex, this EU agency, which is now called European Border and Coast Guard, but everybody still calls it Frontex, it plays a key role. And it's one of the few areas where there's also been agreement in the past years amongst the before the 28 and now 27 member states, is to really revise the mandate and the budget of this agency. It's been revised 3 times in the last 5 years. Its budget has gone up, its staff has gone up, its powers have gone up, and that stands in stark contrast with the European Asylum Support Office, which is this other EU agency which is focusing on asylum. And it's come in now in a kind of a storm of criticism, and maybe we can talk about that later. There's also, and I'll skip a bit. There's a lot of on databases and information systems, but it's maybe a bit too specific. And then we come to the third floor and the most problematic one, or the most sensitive one, which is the internal dimension. And I think a lot of analysts have said that the focus of the EU towards the external, towards the third countries, and maybe also on the border, has been because we couldn't agree internally as to how we would deal with those who actually are allowed to stay within Europe. And so we focused each time on trying to prevent or better manage those who come, so that we don't have to deal with this really hot potato, which is how to share responsibility. And so very briefly, the common European asylum system, I think analysts broadly agree that there's really huge structural challenges that afflict it to date. And so when it was set up in the 1990s, the idea was really, if an asylum seeker comes to an EU member state, the idea is that they should be treated in the same way. They should be the way which you access the asylum procedure, the way in which your dossier is reviewed, the way in which you are given housing, all of these things should be the same. So there is this kind of minimum standards that have been adopted across the EU, but nevertheless, lots of studies have shown that over the years, there's still this kind of very differential treatment of applications, which some say may result in people moving in Europe to other places so that they can secure a better future for themselves and for their families. As we already indicated in 2015, that was really clearly shown. But in the past, it was the same with the Arab Spring and alike, is that national and EU asylum systems really struggled to respond to kind of fluctuating inflows of displaced person, but also this kind of mixed flows. There's this underdevelopment of the external dimension that I already referred to. And the biggest problem, there's a lack of solidarity and sharing of responsibilities. And so what we see with the pact is that they seek to refer to what Hilary already referred to, the kind of famous Dublin system. One thing which is maybe a bit similar as was happening with banks in the wake of the financial crisis, the first thing you do is you want to change the name. You know, there's hairs rise, nerves start to tickle when we mention the Dublin system in Europe. So you need to find. Unfortunately, the Commission didn't come up with the most exciting name. It's called the Regulation on Asylum and Migration Management, the RAM. I'm not sure how that's ever going to replace the Dublin name, but yeah, I mean, maybe the people in Dublin will be really happy that once and for all their association with this flawed system is going to be attacked. But yes, anyway, so what it seeks to do is, on the one hand, increase the ability of the RAM to attain some of Dublin's presence objectives. So Dublin, and so it's clarifying, you know, which are the criteria that would be used to decide which member state is responsible for an asylum seeker when he or she and their family arrives in the EU. The idea is to shorten the procedures, so to really quickly identify who's responsible. And there's also a package about ensuring that applicants cooperate with these procedures. So very briefly here, I have outlined, so the Dublin system is just really a kind of allocation system. It's a mechanism. It's not really kind of another kind of document which would lay out, for example, the grounds on which you can grant asylum in Europe. This is really just, you know, okay, when this person comes in, we'll assign it to entity X and then the other entity Y, etc. And to really, the aim is to prevent multiple applications, what was called asylum shopping and secondary movement, because we of course have a border-free zone, which is called the Schengen zone, and also to prevent asylum seekers just to having to wait for very long for member states to figure out who's responsible for them. But the big thing here is the question as to how stress resistant the Dublin system is, and yeah, 2015 really tested that stress resistance. And so mass influx places the responsibility by law on the external member states. The way in which this mechanism assigns responsibility resulted de facto in external member states having a lot of responsibilities laid on their shoulders in terms of having to conduct border controls, register people who come in, do security checks, and receive asylum seekers. And nevertheless, what also resulted, what we saw is that onward movement to destination countries such as, for example, Germany or the Netherlands or Sweden really continued in the years after the Dublin system was set up. And also, very importantly, while there's a lot of people criticizing the Dublin system for not actually allowing for a fair sharing responsibility across the member states, it was never meant to be such a mechanism. So solidarity was just, and responsibility sharing was never part of Dublin's DNA. So that was really missing from the puzzle. And then, so what we saw is, I just wanted to briefly show, also checking the time just to make sure I'm on track. But what we see is here, I wanted just to outline briefly the stresses on the Dublin system. So here you can see how the irregular border crossings are going up in 2015. We see also how the migration routes are going. So you see how it starts from the external border state from the EU and then goes onwards to different countries, whether it's Germany or other places. And so what happened very quickly, and which I'm just showing some pictures which you may remember, is that very soon some of the external border states, and especially Hungary, started to build fences to prevent people from coming. And what you see as a result of that is that overnight, other member states are being affected. So here you see the shift in migration routes, and so showing how when a member state goes at it alone and just decides what they're going to do in relation to migration really affects the other parts of the EU. And that's really what we saw in that situation. And we saw also that many migrants and asylum seekers reported that they felt extremely unwelcome in Hungary, and as a result started to really walk to different member states. And here there's the big march from Hungary that we may all remember from some of the media reports. that lasted for a little while, and then at some point, of course, the other member states said, well, actually, we don't agree with this approach, we need more solidarity, and they started to reinstate border controls, which normally in a border-free area such as the Schengen is not allowed, at least not for a prolonged period of time. So very briefly, the whole system just broke down. As I said here, member states started to erect physical borders which rerouted flows. We had problems with security checks, so there was accusations of terrorists supposedly hiding in these kind of migration flows. We had the Schengen zone very much under pressure because of internal borders being reinstated. And more broadly, it was just said that it was just unsustainable over time. So what does this new part of the EU Pact seek to do? Well, it says, and Hilary already said it, it's this wonderful phrase that member states are supposed to contribute on a continuous basis. That's the obligatory part, but they can do so in a flexible manner. So there's kind of a menu or a catalog of options from which member states can choose. And either they can relocate, so that means that you take on asylum seekers from, for example, those who are rescued at sea, and you agree to integrate them in your society, provided they are seen as eligible for protection. There's return sponsorship. That's a new concept that was launched in the pact, and which is the idea that another member states can help member states under pressure to return those who have their asylum claim rejected or who just didn't qualify, didn't ask for asylum. And the idea and that's an important one, is that if within 8 months the member state is not able to return them, that member states who has said that they would help us, for example, Hungary said, I'll help the Greeks to return people after 8 months. If they don't succeed in returning these people, they are actually responsible for them, and those people are transferred to Hungary. There's 10,000 euro per person transferred, either through location or return sponsorship, and you can also support with capacity for asylum and return systems. I think I will skip this just in interest of time, but some critical thoughts on this. The interesting part is that flexible solidarity in and of itself was actually proposed by the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, in earlier on. At the time, it was very much criticized by the EU member states, the idea that you could choose how you would contribute to how you managed the asylum and migration system. But as you see, over the time, there's been this significant shift, and now more and more member states, apparently the German presidency concluded that the majority of the member states actually are in favor now of this, and now it's really unpicking or unpacking how it will work in practice. And so you see this kind of really a new chapter appearing in the common European asylum system history and makeup from harmonization. We all do the same. We are clones from one another, on paper at least, and we do all the same task, to differentiation, where we're really, all of us are taking on different kind of tasks. And there's a couple of questions that we have to ask. Will this be sufficient? Is this kind of new proposal sufficient for all EU member states to back this proposal and say, yes, we agree with this? And so what are some of the sticks and carrots for member states to contribute to this shared responsibility exercise? So I think it's the penultimate slide. So the southern states already launched a paper at the end of 2020, and I think many in the Brussels bubble saw the ghosts of the past reappearing. So we feel that states are actually retreating in their policy trenches and taking up the same kind of positions as we saw in the past, and many are now starting to become really worried. The Visegrad countries, as I said, who originally proposed this idea of flexible solidarity, and you would think maybe they would, resonate with it and agree to it, now have said, well, we actually don't want this either, because we're concerned about the fact about this permanent relocation. So yes, we're happy to contribute in terms of border management, return sponsorship, but we don't want to be ultimately responsible if we're not able to return that person. And so the bigger question that many have is it sufficient to mobilize or incentivize member states through this kind of budget at 10,000 that we were referring to, through capacity support, or will we need to bring in other kind of bargaining chips that lay outside of the migration domain? Is it like membership of the Schengen zone, the free border zone? Is it by actually starting to take away or threaten to take away money from the multi-annual financial framework, which member states have agreed to, etc.? And finally, we've seen relocation happen in the past. You may remember that there was this scheme to relocate people from Italy and Greece in 2015, and there was a plan for 98,000, but eventually only 31,000 were relocated, 20,000 from Greece, 10 from Italy. And there was it was really a burdensome process because there was an attempt to try and match asylum seekers with member state, and that really took a lot of time. And so now we're back at this kind of ad hoc mechanism where the Commission has to call member states to ask, are you willing to take up 50 from here and 30 from there? But nevertheless, the Portuguese Presidency has said they're going to tackle the most contentious part of the pact, which is solidarity. And I think this is quite an ambitious one because they also recognize this is the key otherwise. And I may just end with one more thing, and it may also connect then with the connections that Professor Hollyfield is going to make. The key question we have to also ask is not only will this succeed and what is needed for the EU to agree on this, but also the key question that we ask ourselves at MPI is, how long will this conversation be at the center of gravity? How long will it be able to maintain and contain the energies and interests of member states because what we see increasingly is other small groups of member states coming up with their own ideas. And so Denmark, the United Kingdom, Austria, the Visegrad countries are more and more thinking about externalizing completely migration management and the asylum system, and having people arrive in third countries and then only being eligible to come to Europe through resettlement schemes and things like that. So the question is, how long can the EU maintain the attention of the 27 before they shift elsewhere? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hanne. Here you will see Hanne's email and the migration policy. You'll see where you can read more about her work and about the pact. Maybe you put it into the chat, Hanne, your email. So our next speaker is Jim Hollyfield, who's going to be even more concise than Hanne was.
Okay. Well, let me just see if I can get my PowerPoint up and running here. So I think everybody can see this okay. And I'll be scrolling through it fairly quickly because I know Hillary is not going to cut me any slack here. And I'll try to end precisely at 8:54, I guess, or 9:54 your time. So anyone who got up this early and is attending deserves time to ask a question. So let's scroll through this fairly quickly. I want to talk a little bit about more about the logic of migration governance in an age of geopolitical instability. You know, the wars that have been going on in sort of the crescent of instability from West and Sub-Saharan Africa all the way over into South Asia, failed states, and of course now on top of all this we have a pandemic. So, you know, obviously there are many challenges here. If you look at the problems of migration governance, and Europe and the EU have really been in the eye of the storm. I think everyone here knows and understands this. I don't have to spend any time on this really because Hanne did a great job of laying everything out. And Hillary and Hanne, and to the audience, just for the sake of discussion, you might look at the bold in the slide here, which is, I sort of feel like this is a lot of old wine in new bottles. So maybe that'll be a challenge to Hanne if she wants to really stress, you know, what's new about this. But I think probably the best thing I can do is to try to give us a little bit more historical context to what's happening here. And as I promised, to draw some comparisons with the United States. And I want to get just a little bit into the whole logic of cooperation with respect to migration. And I probably won't have time to do this, but I might even have a little theoretical reprise at the end, especially for the international relations students in the audience here. So first slide, Many of you probably have seen these numbers before, but the point here is simply there is no global migration crisis. You know, I spent many years in Boston working at Harvard and MIT, and my late colleague Myron Weiner wrote a little book about this, the global migration crisis, and I used to have a lot of discussions with him about this. But you can see that the numbers have been trending up. Actually, if you project this out, I think we're at about 270 million now, but it's still roughly 3.5% of the world's population. So migration remains the exception, not the rule. But of course, we have experienced a big political crisis around the issue of migration. So when you study migration, you need to look at two things. One are the flows, people coming in and going out. And you also need to look at the stocks. You know, how many migrants do you have? So here, this is just a quick way of looking at migration flows from the 2010 to 2018 period. And you can see that, you know, one of the things that will come up over and over again, we can come back to this in discussion, you know, the Nordics are sort of champions in terms of managing and taking care of a lot of flows, plus some of the smaller European social democracies like Luxembourg and the Swiss. There are some big classic settler countries in this picture, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but then you have Germany right around the EU average, and look at the United States, you know, which in terms of flows is pretty well below the OECD average. And I would just add, we're talking about the Visegrad group of countries. I think they gave themselves this name of Eastern Europe. They're really nowhere really to be seen in this chart. And same thing here, if we look at the share of the foreign-born in the total population, these are the stocks. Again, I'm comparing 2000 and 2019, so you can see the changes over this 9-year period. Israel obviously is very high in there. But again, the Visegrad group is really absent. So the main takeaway here is that for the East Europeans, you know, they don't have any history of migration. They always point out that, look, unlike the West Europeans, you know, we don't have a great imperial or colonial legacy, so they don't feel much historical or cultural responsibility for taking lots of migrants, and they are averse. They are averse to more diversity in their society. Okay, this chart, this was a little bit hard to see, but if you just look at the, this is a breakdown of by percentage of the flows in 2018, and it's broken down by workers, family, accompanying family, humanitarian, other, and free movers. And the thing to look at here is the darkest line, you know, which is the numbers of humanitarian migrants out of the 100% flows. The U.S., even in 2018, was still sort of in the game. We know that this is going to go down significantly in the last couple of years of the Trump administration. And it's important to look at the medium gray lines on the far right here. Those are free movers. So don't forget, when you're looking at the EU, a lot of migrants are actually free movers. And this became a big issue in the whole Brexit debate in the United Kingdom. This is a little bit easier to see, I think, where you get a sense of the proportions and the numbers when you break it down, the flows in 2016 by percentages. This is a little bit older, but you can see how the two big countries here, the United States, of course, taking lots and lots of migrants. We take over 1 million a year normally, and the Germans, of course, also received a very large number of migrants. It's harder to get the sense for Sweden. Sweden is very important, Austria pretty important, and so forth and so on. In the US, you see the dominance of families, humanitarian and free movers in Germany and Sweden. So the US and Germany are taking in the most immigrants in absolute terms in the OECD world. Okay, just to get a little comparative perspective here, this shows you the flows of refugees into the United States. So one of the takeaways here is if you think there's a refugee crisis, it's certainly not in the United States, because the refugee numbers have been declining since the great wave of the Vietnamese and since the end of the Cold War, and the whole process of resettling refugees in the United States. It makes refugee flows easy to manage, and of course we have the we have the advantage of being geographically isolated from where the large refugee flows are in the world. So we managed this pretty well, and the numbers have fallen off significantly in the 2000s. And here you can see another way of looking at the U.S. You can see the Vietnamese Southeast Asian crisis, which extends from the 1970s to 1980s. Actually, there were a lot of Chinese and other Cold War refugees in the 90s. But by the time you get into the 2000s and look at 2018 here, refugee numbers are way, way down. Admissions are way down, and Trump was trying to cut them basically to zero. So when you think about burden sharing or responsibility sharing, the U.S. was running very much in the opposite direction. And if you look at asylum applications in the United States, we know that those have been gradually trending up. We're back to a higher point, but still, we're only at about 30,000 asylum seekers, and this went down in the last 2 years of the Trump administration. And individuals granted asylum in the U.S., we have been fairly stable, hovering in the mid 20,000s, falling again more in the last couple of years of the Trump administration. Now look at Europe here. I mean, look at the contrast. I mean, in 2015-16, Europe took in over 1.2 million asylum seekers. Compare that with 20, 30,000. So I mean, what a very, very sharp contrast between Europe, the EU, and the United States. And here, I just wanted to quickly lay out for the audience to think about the big migration refugee crisis of 2015-16. I think we have to see this as an absolute humanitarian disaster, which is what it was, originating in the Middle East with the wars in Syria and Iraq. But don't forget South Asia and Africa. And of course, you even had some people coming, from the Balkans and elsewhere. So once you open the door a little bit, as the Europeans did, there was a great rush towards the door. And this was a moral and a legal crisis, because the Europeans are mostly of them are committed to the UN human rights system and the Refugee Convention. So the moral crisis, however, and this is important to remember, it comes with a moral hazard. So when you say things like the German chancellor did in 2015, 2016, wir schaffen das, we can do this, it quickly came schaffen wir das, are we going to be able to do this? And so this morphed into what Hanne Beirens was talking about, a policy and a political crisis. The Dublin regime, I would say, never really worked, never functioned. We can get into the details on that. But the Dublin system absolutely collapsed. You have a threat to Schengen itself, to free movement, and this began to undermine one of the key pillars of the EU. So hence we have now the need for a new Migration and Asylum Pact, which is what we're discussing today. To go back a little bit to context and numbers, if you look at the EU asylum applicants, they are very much concentrated in Germany and Sweden. Those are the two champions, as you can see here on the left. The French are also taking a lot of asylum applicants, but the French also are not doing very well in terms of burden sharing. But the frontline states, obviously Italy, Greece, but again, look, the absence here. You can begin to see some of the Visegrad group that are starting to appear in the numbers. These are just EU asylum applicants. Sweden is, again, the champion. So one of the things I think we really need to ask ourselves is, what is it about the Swedes? Why are the Swedes so willing to step up and take the lead in all this? Sweden leads in applications per capita, asylum applicants per capita outpaces all except Malta. But here we see Hungary coming into the mix. Germany, on the other hand, is down around the average for the EU. So what is it about the Swedes? I keep coming back to this. And again, I put some of this stuff together with a close French colleague, so I apologize that some of it is in French. I didn't have time to go back and put it. But if you look at this slide, it shows Germany and Sweden are the most generous. This is the main point in processing and accepting asylum applicants. France and the United Kingdom, boy, they're way, way down. Again, big question. What is it about the social democracies? You can see the French are not so good. The UK, yeah, they're down here in terms of not taking very many, accepting asylum applicants. So this is just to show you the problems that Hanne was referring to in this pact about, how do we share the burden? How do we share the responsibility? How do we create solidarity? Here you can see it in the numbers. And if you look at the, another way of looking at generosity is granting of asylum per capita. Again, what is it about Sweden? What is it about Germany? They're at the top of the charts with Austria and Malta in the mix. France and the UK are really nowhere in sight. The UK is very, very low. So again, think about this. Look at these countries. Think about the politics that swirls around this migration pact. So the initial humanitarian impulse in 2015 and 16, the response in Europe, Germany really took the lead, moving from we're not an immigration country to we have a welcoming culture. We can do this. Can we really do this? Merkel famously said, if we rescued the banks, we can save the refugees, referring, of course, to the Euro crisis. So this was, and I'd love to get Hillary engaged on this and others. This was a chance for redemption for the Germans. They could show, Germany took a pounding in the Euro crisis. Now they can step up and take a lead in the refugee crisis. So a remarkable humanitarian response, almost 1 million arrivals in Germany alone in 2015. And Merkel, this is a key point, guys, think about it. Merkel expected all the other European Union nations to step up and follow her lead, but they didn't do that. So Germany, it turns out, cannot manage the exodus unilaterally. And there's a huge need for burden responsibility sharing and a common European policy, which is what Ms. von der Leyen and the Commission are trying to accomplish. So the EU must, but in all of this, the EU is really, there's a lot of pressure to regain control of the borders, and the ultimate solution, as we saw in the US, was to make Turkey a safe third country, the same way the US made Mexico a safe third country, and this is what we call in international relations a suasion game. These are just some pictures, picture of me in the Ruhrgebiet. I think this was taken in Bochum. You can see the sign there. The German, this is, I think, Caritas reminding Germans, we too were once refugees and asylum seekers. And the biggest catastrophe in a situation like this is to forget our responsibilities. So again, you can see the incredible moral weight here. But again, as I said earlier, moral hazard looms. This is a great picture, as you remember, of Chancellor Merkel with, I think, a Syrian asylum seeker saying, we can do this, we can take care of these people. Okay, here is my fancy slide. I promised to get to that, and according to my clock, I still have 4 minutes left, Hillary. Yeah, I have 4 minutes. I started at 8:33. 8:34. So here, I want you to, maybe I'll try to conclude with this picture. Migration is an incredibly complex political game. It pulls countries, it pulls governments in 4 different directions. Obviously there's a market dimension to this. There's a rights dimension to this, status dimension. How many people do we need? What kind of status or rights are we going to give them? That's the normal debate. But when you get in these crisis situations, quickly security becomes an issue. Are the migrants and asylum seekers going to be a threat? And then the worst case scenario, culture inserts itself, and there's a fear that society is going to be transformed by this migration. So here is my fancy slide. If you think that this is a complicated game, it's a multidimensional game taking place within governments and within states. It is also a multi-level game because it's happening at the international level, it's happening at the regional and the EU level, and the game is also going on at the national level, and even at the local level, at the level of cities. So just think about how incredibly complicated this game is. It is the worst nightmare for a politician to deal with this. And of course, now we can see the EU, the Commission, the Council, the EU is struggling to find a regional response to this. I don't have time to go into much about the limits of migration governance, but some have argued that there's a strict trade-off between the rights you give to people and the numbers of people you're able to take in. Martin Roos and Philip Martin and others who've written about this. But Sweden defies the logic. You know, Sweden takes very large numbers and immediately gives them quite expansive rights. So one way to approach this migration governance problem is to try to do it regionally, and that's exactly what the EU is doing. One would assume that the asymmetries in Europe are manageable, but we can see from this process, it's been years since the big crisis in 2015-16, and the EU is not there yet. So what you have is you have a retreat from cooperation. You have a retreat from the public goods approach where you're trying to create something where everybody can benefit from it and share the costs. But what you end up with are these suasion games, the carrots and the sticks, the EU-Turkey, the US-Mexico. Here is a good picture just to make you think about this. A pretty way of thinking about suasion games or tactical issue linkage in international relations. We've got to step in. Everybody's coming through Turkey. We got to pay the Turks, bribe the Turks to do this. This is exactly what the United States did with Mexico. So I see Hillary shaking her finger at me, and I have actually reached the end of my presentation. So if anyone wants to talk about what this global public goods approach entails and talk more about the regional dynamic, I am happy to do that. So Hillary, Professor Silver, on that note, I shall conclude and we can start our discussion.
Okay, that sounds terrific. Thank you, Jim, for keeping to time. I really appreciate it because I want to give our audience an opportunity to send put their questions now in the question and answer, the Q&A box. And I particularly want to invite my two colleagues who co-organize Catherine to see if they have anything that they would like to ask first. So please put your questions in the Q&A. And I thought I would give Hanne a moment to respond to Jim's fancy schmancy four-dimensional, three-level model there. No, but perhaps more about the question of burden sharing, which I think is an interesting comparative issue that he raises, and it's very rarely discussed, even though Trump has made asylum seeking an issue. So while people are putting their questions in the Q&A, perhaps, Jim, turn off your phone.
Yes, I'm about to do that right now. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
It's off.
Okay. So Hanne, do you want to comment while we're waiting for some questions?
Yes, thank you very much. And it was really interesting, Professor Holby, to see the slides. Also, I really loved all the graphs. I think that really shows in a very, very startling way, the ways in which different countries are involved in this kind of global issue of how to protect those who are needed protection. But maybe I just wanted to add maybe an additional layer to what you were saying, not in terms of the 4 layers, but a layer broadly in terms of our discussion, is indeed, I think what we saw as a result of the 2015-2016 crisis, that there was a lot of elections in different, both at the regional and national level, and a lot of different kind of political parties, but also the kind of government that came into place actually had explicitly in their government agreements, 2015 will never happen again, and we will never be seen again as being, confronted with chaos and being seen by the public as not able to control migration. And so it's both in terms of managing arrivals, but it's also in terms of deciding and making sure that we actually can return. So there's a lot of focus on return now as well, like in order to show that we can manage. But I think what I wanted just to say is I think the COVID pandemic has added an additional layer to this, in the sense that governments or political parties who had said we need to avoid spontaneous arrivals, we need to be able to manage it from outside of Europe, suddenly got like a taste of what it means to have 0 arrivals. Like you were saying, Professor Hollyfield, that President Trump was trying to also cut down arrivals to 0. This is a number of countries saw over the last year, 0 people arriving, and that really got them a sense of this is how it looks like, this is what it means. And I think this has further complicated the discussions. And I'll shut up now just to see if there's any interesting questions for us.
Although there are some, let me just read you two that came in from my two colleagues. Hope Harrison wants to know how immigration is going to play out given the new German elections and the end of Merkel's time in office, which is an interesting question. And my colleague from French Studies, Catherine Kleppinger, has asked, interestingly enough, whether in the French case, how President Macron is dealing with positioning to the 2020 elections. So since we have two, it's the French-German axis in our study group that I guess I want to pose that to you first.
Yeah, c'est le fameux couple franco-allemand. This is the great Franco-German. I call them le vieux couple marié. This is an old married couple that we're talking about. So, but now that the British have left, we're back very much to the Franco-German core of Europe, and the politics of this in Germany and France. I don't think they are that dramatically different. However, the AfD. The Alternative für Deutschland was having a pretty good run following the great refugee crisis of 2015 and 16. But my looking at the numbers, they've fallen off quite a bit, right, Hillary? They have not had a good pandemic, I think, the AfD. They've struggled. So migration politics in Germany right now are incredibly fluid, incredibly dynamic. The migration refugee issue is always lurking, I think, there in the background. And you look at the struggle within the CDU and the CSU, over who's going to lead the party. You've got a harder line character in Merz, Laschet, and the others seem to be a bit more on the left. Macron himself, of course, has to constantly be looking over his shoulder at Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National. So the question is whether the Rassemblement National and Marine Le Pen, whether they're going to get enough momentum to really be able to challenge Macron. And the final thing I would say about that, some have accused Macron of taking a page out of the Sarkozy playbook, moving to the right, going to the right. The big crisis with the assassination of the school teacher in Paris. This has brought a new round of Islamophobia. And Macron has been pretty darn tough on the whole migration asylum issue, and you can see it in the numbers. I'll stop there.
Hanne, did you want to say anything about this topic? I know it's political, so maybe you don't.
Well, maybe one element I also maybe want to add. I think the contrast, for example, between the position of President Macron now versus 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, he came forward saying, really trying to be seen as the kind of vanguard, the protector of the Schengen free border zone. And he was saying that we need to rethink the asylum system. All the member states part of the Schengen zone should carry their weight, and we would have to revisit the responsibility of asylum. But last year, I think because of indeed some of the events and for example, decapitation of the teacher, we saw a different kind of thread being woven into the migration discourse of the president and the ministers, in the sense that you really have this kind of almost securitization. So security is really being woven into the whole migration discourse. And I think we see that in a number of countries where it's constantly focused about public security first, and then the call for migrants and the protection of asylum seekers second.
And Hillary, if I could just quickly add to that, to go back to my little fancy multidimensional box. I mean, one great takeaway there is that the pandemic has reinforced the security dynamic. So for those who want to close borders, shut down mobility, keep people at a distance, don't let them in, don't let them ask for asylum. The pandemic has really, really strengthened their hand politically. And of course, we could see Trump was playing on that. And I think a lot of the Europeans, of course, are watching this also very cautiously, worried about the public health dimensions of uncontrolled migration.
Right. In fact, we do have a question in the chat from Lydia Saw that says that UN COVAX says they're going to be reserving 5% of vaccine doses for migrants, refugees, and vulnerable populations, but that the responsibility to vaccinate actually falls on the host countries. So I wonder if, have you followed any of this about vaccine responsibilities, vaccination responsibilities?
Well, I mean, the EU is under under enormous amount of pressure right now to develop a sort of a comprehensive, coordinated public health policy approach to vaccinations. And we know that the EU and the Commission have stumbled a little bit coming out of the box on this. So, you know, if I just would quickly say, if you add the financial crisis, the euro crisis, the refugee crisis, the asylum crisis, and now the public health emergency and COVID, you know, the EU is taking a bit of a pounding. But as someone sitting here in Texas and knowing how Texas thinks about Washington and our federal government in this country, you know, if you have a federal or confederal system, you know, the pressures and the tensions between the core and the periphery are always going to be very, very strong.
All right. Well, we have another question that's somewhat related to that maybe Hanne can answer. It's kind of a factual question. Does the new pact specify the maximum period? This is from Victoria Jones. Does Europe's new pact specify the maximum period of time that a person can wait in a refugee camp? And what are the moral arguments raised about the humanity of staying in a refugee camp and raising children there and putting them possibly at risk of mortal danger?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think, Hilary, as you also referred to, I think the fires in Moria and the situation on the Greek islands is something that really has been picked up by the media and resonates with the publics across Europe. Some people have been there for 2 years or longer. Some people have waited for a definitive outcome on their asylum claim for 2 years now. And so this is really a problem that the pact says it wants to address. And so in the pact, as I said, it goes really, it's very operational, and it also has these kind of timeframes within which a person should be screened, one person should have their asylum procedure finished and their return, all these kind of things. But we've had this for 20 years now. We've had legislation stating how long an asylum procedure should last, but every kind of implementation study we conducted, and I did part of those, shows that people sometimes have to wait 2, 3, 5 years. And so unless you have something in place that will, that will result in sanctions or some kind of actions that will result in member states having to really address this issue, the danger is that, that the situation will stay as it is. So,
Yeah. We have a whole bunch. Now, I'm cognizant of the time. So I know that some people may be dropping out, but I'd like to take a few more questions if you wouldn't mind. Is that okay? Can you hang on? All right, so let me try to combine some of them. Iris Strauss asks, does the process risk recreating the migration crisis and intensifying the EU's blame for it? The integration was supposed to bring all the member groups and member states along with these policies, and not just the governments. That's the problem with Europe. Everyone says it's top down and it's imposed on states. One piece of the question, and then somebody's asked, Carl has asked, how effective is Portugal likely to be then in advancing this reform agenda? And I thought also here, can the EU partner? There's some questions about third party countries, about. There's a question about root causes for the external dimension, how the EU is going to partner with third countries to spread awareness, and so on.
I could just come in.
How do they partner with third countries?
I could just come in with two quick points, and then I'd love to hear Hanne's thoughts about this. But I mean, one big, huge takeaway for this whole episode, for the audience is, countries cannot do this unilaterally. I don't care whether they're in Europe or North America or wherever. you at least have to have bilateral, and preferably multilateral cooperation, because whatever happens in one country affects another country. So that's a first point, and the EU should be, the EU should be able to get on top of this, because they have very strong ties with the sending countries. The second point I would make, I was going to make this in my presentation, and it goes back to the earlier question as well. If you try to bottle people up in the camps and in the countries, obviously this is going to be expensive. It's also going to really hurt the prospects for development in these populations. But it's also a danger from a security standpoint, because you're creating these camps, which become prime recruiting grounds for the terrorist organizations like Daesh. So, but the final thing I would say is, if you look at the picture and you look at the maps that Hanne put up earlier, I mean, the Turks really are in the driver's seat here. They're a critical player in this. So we probably should talk a lot more about Turkey and what's happening in Turkey in this regard.
Right. Hanne?
Yes, thanks very much. Yeah, I think I very much agree with Professor Hollyfield in the sense that the pact already says very clearly at the outset that migration is something normal, and it also says, conveys that, if you go at it alone, there's serious consequences tied to this. And so I think the crisis thing, and I think both of us referred to that. It's not so much the numbers, it's also it's an institutional crisis. And so even though last year, so we had about in 2015, like more than 800,000 people arrive. Last year it was 124, the year before 149,000. So it's really gone drastically down. But nevertheless, migration really dominates the political agenda, the discussion between member states. So it continues to be an issue. It could plunge the EU in a more severe crisis if the numbers would go up. But also, secondly, as Professor Hollyfield was just outlining, we're becoming more and more dependent on agreements with third countries in preventing people to come in the first place. Turkey, with Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, there's all different kinds of agreements being set upon that. And hence we become very dependent in terms of our how much political capital, how much financial budgets are we willing to spend to make sure that these third countries continue to prevent that kind of migration movement. And what happens if they suddenly turn around and say this is not sufficient, or we don't agree? And then the third one, on which I was saying at the end of my presentation, I really think there's another lurking crisis, which is that there are subsets of member states now thinking about a different solution to migration. And then the question remains, how long can we maintain that kind of gravity of discussion?
Right. So on that note, to end webinar, at least its formal recorded part of it. And I want to thank the audience and our speakers for really informative and thoughtful analysis of the current situation of migration in Europe since the COVID epidemic. Thank you so much. I hope that you will continue to attend our Europe Since COVID speaker series. We're working on another one to talk a bit about refugees, and particularly other countries that have been facing crises, or at least have been very central in the debate. So please stay tuned for another event later in this semester, and you will be able to find the recording of the event as well if you'd like to share it with others. So once again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Hillary.
Have a good day.
Thanks. Yep.
Thank you. Bye.